History as it happens, August 10th, 2021. Reconsidering Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
A short time ago, an American airplane dropped one bomb on Hiroshima and destroyed its usefulness to the enemy. That bomb has more power than 20,000 tons of TNT. The Japanese began the war from the air at Pearl Harbor. They have been repaid manyfold.
76 years ago, President Harry Truman ordered the atomic bombings that ended the Second World War while inaugurating a new age where men could harness science and technology to create weapons of previously unimaginable power. The question persists because it must. Was it necessary to drop the bomb? World-renowned war historian Sir Antony Beevor joins us next as we report history as it happens, a podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.
The reason why the Japanese did not surrender earlier, and why, right to the very end, even after the two atomic bombs were dropped, was because it was not the Japanese people, it was the Imperial Japanese Army, it was the Supreme Command, which was refusing to do so.
As the USS Augusta carried him back across the Atlantic from the Potsdam Conference, Harry Truman delivered a radio address about one of the most consequential decisions any human has ever made. It was August 6, 1945, and his unemotional, staid delivery belied the momentous nature of the event.
It is an atomic bomb. It is a harnessing of the basic power of the universe. The force from which the sun draws his power has been loosed against those who brought war to the Far East.
3 days later, having heard nothing from the Japanese, the U.S. dropped another bomb on Nagasaki. And then on August 15th, Emperor Hirohito delivered a radio address of his own. Japan would finally surrender. Most Japanese had never heard their ruler's voice before. The enemy has begun to employ a new and most cruel bomb, said the emperor, the power of which to do damage is indeed incalculable. About 120,000 people were killed in the immediate blasts. Tens of thousands more died in the radioactive aftermath. The atomic bombings followed months of fire bombings by the U.S. on dozens of Japanese cities that killed even more civilians. The closing chapter in the cruelest war ever fought, a war in which Imperial Japan murdered and raped its way across much of East Asia. In 2016, Barack Obama became the first American president to visit Hiroshima. He did not apologize for any U.S. actions during the war, but he joined Prime Minister Shinzo Abe in calling for peace and an end to nuclear weapons.
There are many sites around the world that chronicle this war, memorials that tell stories of courage and heroism, graves and empty camps that echo of unspeakable depravity. Yet in the image of a mushroom cloud that rose into these skies, we are most starkly reminded of humanity's core contradiction. How the very spark that marks us as a species, our thoughts, our imagination, our language, our tool-making, our ability to set ourselves apart from nature and bend it to our will, those very things also give us the capacity for unmatched destruction.
One reason Obama offered no apology is most Americans to this day believe the atomic bombings were necessary and justified. Necessary to end the war and avoid a costly land invasion of Japan, justified because of the atrocities Japan committed in China and elsewhere. Many historians agree with at least the first part of that, the military necessity. Some also argue a case for moral retribution. But in the decade since 1945, other historians, often called revisionists, have raised troubling questions about the alternatives Truman chose not to explore. They point to the fact that the invasion of Kyushu was planned for the fall, the invasion of Honshu, the main island, the following March. So why rush to drop the bomb in August? And these revisionists have questioned the estimates of how many American soldiers might have died invading the Japanese home islands, pointing to the fact that some estimates were significantly lower than the off-cited 1 million or 500,000 U.S. casualties. And then there is the atomic diplomacy thesis. It says the Truman administration decided not to look for other ways to end the war that might have taken more time because they were desperate to avoid a massive Soviet military presence in the Far East, on top of concerns about what the Soviets were already doing in Eastern Europe. So I'm not sure where I stand on this, but I'm not ready yet to concede to the traditionalists. It is worth exploring whether there was another way instead of dropping atomic bombs on civilians, who were living in two defenseless cities in a nation that was defeated but had yet to surrender. Sir Antony Beevor is one of the world's preeminent war historians. His work has appeared in 35 languages, sold more than 8 million copies, and won numerous prestigious awards. And he's currently writing a history of the Russian Civil War. Sir Antony, welcome back to the podcast.
Thank you very much, Mike.
So let me start by asking you how you arrived at your position that the two bombings were of military necessity to end the war, and how did you conclude that it saved lives, both American and Japanese?
I don't agree that the alternatives were so straightforward as some people have argued. Some claim that the invasion of the Red Army across northern China, starting on the 8th of August, was going to force Japan to surrender. One has to remember that the Imperial Japanese General Staff was absolutely obsessed about communism and would have been prepared to fight to the end far more desperately against the Red Army than against the Americans from that point of view. So I don't entirely follow that argument at all. I think the reason for saying that it actually saved lives is, of course, a sort of a mathematical observation. But one has to remember how many people were dying already. We have the Battle of Okinawa. Now, 25% of the civilians on Okinawa were killed during the course of that fighting. So the Americans had a very clear idea by that stage of how desperate the defense of the home islands were likely to be. And that is why they came up with their estimate that Operation Olympic, the invasion of Kyushu, would take at least 100,000 Allied casualties. And they estimated 250,000 for Operation Coronet the following March in 1946. But onto those figures, you have to remember there were altogether some 132,000 Allied prisoners of war who were dying of starvation. And all of those would have died by March 1946. I mean, there's no doubt about that. Worse than that, of course, we tend to overlook all of the subject populations under Japanese occupation. And already the figures for that are that sort of anything up to 400,000 were dying every single month of starvation. 2 million had died in Indochina as a result of Japanese occupation. So there was a considerable argument, a humanitarian argument, if you like, which can justify the fact that unless you ended that occupation very rapidly by a Japanese surrender, it wouldn't have stopped any other way, then far more people would have died than died actually under the atomic bombs. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean, for goodness sake, of course, that the dropping of the bombs was a humanitarian act. Far from it. It was basically designed to save Allied lives. It wasn't necessarily designed to save the lives of the indigenous populations of Southeast Asia. But I think one has to remember also the mentality of the time. There was an anger, a lot of it was obviously racist in many ways, just as the Japanese themselves had very strong racist views about the Chinese, who they described as below pigs. And there was, of course, very much of a racist attitude amongst both British, Australian, and above all American troops in their attitudes towards the Japanese. So I'm not trying to say that we can entirely disassociate ourselves from the prejudices and the feelings of that particular period, far from it. But I do think, though, we must take into account this feeling about what the Japanese were doing in terms of cruelty. Unit 731 in Harbin was still carrying out these appalling experiments on human prisoners, mainly Chinese, but also some Allied prisoners of war, who they were referring to as logs, and they were also preparing biological warfare for the defense of the home islands. So one has to look not just at individual elements of the decision-making, but of, if you like, the cumulative effect of all of these aspects, which indicated that any attempt at invasion of the home islands of Japan would be catastrophic, certainly for Allied casualties, but above all, in fact, for Japanese ones, because the Imperial Japanese Army was basically planning to create this civilian militia with 18 million civilians and arming them with bamboo spears and satchel charges to act as suicide bombers in the event of an Allied invasion. Now, it may not have come to that at the time, but that was certainly what they had to plan for.
It is quite a paradox, though, to discuss two weapons saving lives when they instantly wiped out tens of thousands of lives.
Of course.
What are the estimates of how many people died? About 140,000 in Hiroshima, 74,000 in Nagasaki. Do those sound right to you?
That's right, yes. It was sort of 35,000 at the time, but then many more died later at Nagasaki, absolutely. But actually, of course, many more died in the firebombing of Tokyo, where there you had 83,000 dead and another 41,000 severely injured. We talk, understandably, with the horrors of atomic warfare, but, is it worse to die in a firestorm in Tokyo, or is it worse to die with an atomic explosion? Is one justifiable? Is one less of an atrocity than the other?
To your point, the historian David M. Kennedy wrote in his marvelous book, Freedom from Fear, by August 1945, the atomic bombs hardly represented a moral novelty. The moral rules that had once stayed men's hands from taking up weapons of mass destruction against non-combatants had long since been violently breached in World War II, first in the aerial attacks on European cities, then even more wantonly in the systemic firebombing of Japan. So that's an important context here when we're discussing the atomic bombs. The United States had already decided that it was okay, if you will, to incinerate civilians.
Yes, but there was an interesting debate over the air war in Europe. The American Air Force was claiming that they were going in for pickle barrel bombing and all of those cliches, when in fact we know perfectly well that bombing was actually not much more accurate than the RAF bombing by night. So there was a certain amount, I think, of hypocrisy over the whole question of the way that civilians have been targeted in Europe. I would be the first to admit that Bomber Harris, our Chief Marshal Harris of Bomber Command, was a brutal, absolutely inhuman character in many ways, who actually boasted about the acreage or the area of German cities that he was laying waste. But he was completely open about his view, and I'm afraid a completely wrong view, that air war could end a war and therefore save more lives. And this was the trouble, again, which might be applied in the case of Japan, that the air forces always tried to argue that theirs was the quickest way to end a war, and ultimately maybe cruel in the short term, but ultimately was more humane because less people would die. That wasn't the case necessarily in Europe. It did help, for example, the advance of the Red Army and probably accelerated the end of the war, and from that point of view, but it certainly didn't accelerate the war because it did not persuade the Germans to surrender any earlier at all.
Curtis LeMay, who led the firebombing campaign of Japanese cities, said he was done with so-called precision bombing. He said, "I tell you what war is about. You've got to kill people, and when you've killed enough, they stop fighting." But the Japanese didn't stop fighting. Why, after the firebombings, did the Japanese not surrender sooner? It took 2 atomic bombings, but as you mentioned, more people died in the firebombing of Tokyo.
The reason why the Japanese did not surrender earlier, and why right to the very end, even after the 2 atomic bombs were dropped, was because it was not the Japanese people, it was the Imperial Japanese Army, it was the Supreme Command, which was refusing to do so. Now, this was partly because notions of honor, very perverted notions of honor, established the idea that because General Tojo, right from the start, had said no Japanese soldier is ever to surrender, and that we can ever even consider as a nation surrendering, they felt that they could not change their mind. But there was also, as I mentioned earlier, this obsession about the fear of communism, even, funnily enough, within Japan itself, if there was a surrender, that somehow communists who actually didn't really exist would would suddenly come out of hiding in Tokyo or whatever to take over. But it was an absolute mindset which simply could not be shifted. Now, there was a peace party, if you like, amongst some of the civilian politicians, but they had no power. Ever since that earlier period where the military had started to exert its power and the civilian politicians were really pushed sideways, there was really no hope. There was a mindset of aggression, of occupation, which goes back a lot further than we think. We have to remember that Japan was an ally, both of the United States and Britain, in the First World War. But then during the Russian Civil War, as I've just been studying now, the Japanese ambitions of not just taking over Manchuria and Korea, they were extending to a large part of Siberia too. So from that point of view, there is a notion. In fact, I remember there was actually a Japanese officer telling an American officer, this is in 1919, saying to him, you have to realize that soon the whole world will be speaking Japanese. This was, as I say, in 1919. So this military determination, if you like, to conquer the world had gone all the way far back.
And I do want to remind our listeners that as we reconsider these decisions to drop atomic bombs on Japan, that we must do so keeping in mind the information the leaders had at the time and the context of the times, so it doesn't sound like I'm simply second-guessing. So let's talk a little bit more about the information that Truman and his administration had and the alternatives that were available to them. Which choices did they opt not to take?
Well, the choices rather depended on basically reducing their own casualty rate and shortening the war. Now, it's certainly true there was an impatience to shorten the war, which had been going on for such a long period of time. And obviously they wanted to shorten the war because of the suffering which continued for every single day throughout the whole of the Pacific Basin and all of those areas under Japanese occupation. What were the alternatives? Indeed, well, negotiation was not happening in the sense that the Potsdam Declaration, which basically was laying out the Allied terms for surrender, was in fact amended and softened because they allowed the imperial succession and the constitutional setup in Japan to survive after surrender. That was an important concession made. There were many within the administration who didn't want to allow that, but Truman accepted the recommendations of, shall we say, the more enlightened ones, that this was essential if they wanted to achieve any development in that particular area. But even the so-called peace party of the politicians were determined that, for example, that Japan should hold on to Manchuria and Korea. Now, that, of course, was totally unacceptable to all of the Allies and not surprisingly, therefore, was rejected when they proposed that. The other alternative was to hope that the shock of the Red Army of rampaging across northern China, where there were still 1 million Japanese troops retreating basically towards the eastern coast as they'd been ordered. But then one has all of those Japanese garrisons all over still left behind in many parts of the Pacific theater, who had been ordered by Imperial Japanese headquarters to resort to self-sufficiency, which was a euphemism for cannibalism, i.e. they were killing and eating prisoners. And this was something which was kept very quiet at the Tokyo War Crimes trial because the American and the Australian War Crimes Commissions realized the shock and effect that would have on families back in the United States and everywhere else if they started to think that their relative, father, brother, whoever, had died in a prison camp and might have been eaten, because obviously the psychological trauma would have been appalling. This was the information that they had. They also had the estimates of casualties for Operations Olympic and Coronet, but those figures used to change. I mean, at one point it was estimated to be 500,000, and then it went down to 100,000 and 250,000 or whatever. Anyway, the numbers would have been huge. There can be no doubt about that, even if they'd been only half that. But on the other hand, that didn't even take into account, there were no estimates really at that particular stage of how many Japanese civilians would have died in the occupation or the fighting to occupy the home islands.
So the Potsdam Declaration did include a clause allowing for the emperor the institution of the emperor to remain.
When amended.
This was all happening in a context of demands for unconditional surrender. That was one condition in the Potsdam Declaration, but no other conditions, at least at that juncture, were offered to the Japanese. This does sound like a second guess or a counter-historical, but one possible way of ending the war without resorting to atomic bombs might have been softening the demand for unconditional surrender, right?
That would certainly be one way of doing it, it is true. But I don't think that would have actually changed the mentality of the military, for whom it was a question of honor. One has to remember it was an almost sort of a hysterical belief that they had whipped themselves into, that any form of surrender was total dishonor. And I mean, to give an idea of how far this went, the way that the Japanese military was fighting this, even up to the very night before the emperor's declaration. And it was only, and this goes back to the Nagasaki, on the 9th of August, that was the evening when the emperor actually called another meeting of the Supreme Council, because he was shaken by what he'd heard, by then partly of the effect on Hiroshima, but also he was starting to think in the way that this is the way it's going to have to go. We're going to have to accept the Potsdam Declaration. But the military was still absolutely firmly against it. But then it was only finally on the 14th of August when the emperor actually told the military that he was going to accept the Potsdam Declaration and that he was going to make a broadcast which was recorded for the next day. And that is when there was this attempted military coup to find the emperor, and they were searching the whole palace. He had to be hidden so that they could try and destroy this tape. And even then, there were kamikaze flights which set out the next morning against the order of the emperor, simply so as to sort of die in a final attack against the Americans. So it was a mentality which you cannot generalize about Japan or about the Japanese, but this was a mentality where the army and the navy, but particularly the army, had basically taken the whole of the Japanese population hostage. And there is not very much you can do when you're dealing with that form of determination.
Let's talk a little bit more about attitudes and propaganda on both sides and how they serve to reinforce ideas about what the enemy would do to you. For instance, Japanese propaganda about mobilizing the entire population in defense of the islands, its suicidal policies that you write about in your book, The Second World War, kamikazes, the sacrifice of civilians on Saipan. Those encouraged the United States to believe it had no choice but to deal brutally with the Japanese. And also, the Japanese had ideas of what Americans would do to them. And of course, the war in reality was brutal. It's been described as a race war of annihilation on both sides.
It was indeed. And, there was dehumanization, partly, I think, because of the conditions of the fighting, the jungle. It was something which was not in any way familiar to Western troops, or Australian, British, American. It was already, as I say, in an alien environment, and the enemy were seen as aliens. And I mean, we saw the way that Marine Corps soldiers would decapitate the dead and boil their heads and then sell the skulls as souvenirs back in the States. It was, from that point of view, yes, perhaps a war divided by race, with racism on both sides.
Sir Antony, I want to correct something I said about the Potsdam Declaration. The question I asked you was not clear. The initial Potsdam Declaration did not include a concession about the emperor, but it was put in later on. So to my earlier point about whether a softer or more conciliatory approach to Japan might have brought about an end to the war, some historians have pointed out that the United States should have just included the concession about the emperor in the initial Potsdam Declaration.
That is true, and it might possibly have helped, but I think that would have only really helped the civilian peace party, but they simply did not have the decisive strength at that particular time. It was still the military who held really all the cards, and it was only when the emperor himself was shocked by the atomic bombs into deciding to accept the Potsdam Declaration that one actually saw that sort of vital movement.
Why did the United States rush to drop the second bomb on Nagasaki and not give it more time? because the invasion of Kyushu, as you mentioned, wasn't until much later in the year, and the planned invasion of Honshu wasn't until March of the following year.
I think the very fact that there had been no response whatsoever to the dropping of the Hiroshima bomb obviously exasperated them. Now, there is another element, and this is where we come into the whole question of Cold War diplomacy and all the rest of it. To what degree was the Red Army invasion of northern China and the Far East a key factor? Well, it was certainly a factor. There was, amongst a number, particularly of the more extremely anti-communist senior officials or officers, there was definitely a sort of a slight thrill. This will show Stalin that, we've got this very, very powerful weapon. But to say that that was the one reason for dropping the atomic bombs is ridiculous. I mean, there is always a mixture of motives in major decisions like this. But it was a small element, and it was certainly, one can't ignore it.
This is the so-called atomic diplomacy thesis that has entered the historiography, that the United States was worried about the Soviet presence not only in the Far East, but also with what was going on in Eastern Europe at the time. So some historians have posited or asked the question about whether or not the bombings were not only the last shot of World War II, but the first shot of the Cold War.
Well, then one can get into a wonderfully circular argument about the origins of the Cold War. I mean, I would certainly argue, actually, that the origins of the Cold War lie in 1941. I mean, the real shock that Stalin received by having been so gulled by Hitler that he was caught out completely when Operation Barbarossa started on the 21st of June, 1941. And he was determined that the Soviet Union should never be caught out in the same way. And that is why he was determined to have the cordon sanitaire of satellite states across Central Europe, which, of course, is totally unacceptable to the West. There they were hoping to liberate Europe, but in fact, then they came up with this appalling paradox that because of their alliance with the Soviet Union, that actually roughly half of Europe was actually going to be under the control of another totalitarian dictatorship.
We've already discussed how the United States laid waste to dozens of Japanese cities starting in March of 1945, the wholesale firebombing of those cities. Why were Hiroshima and Nagasaki chosen for the atomic weapons?
The reason why Hiroshima was chosen was simply because it had not actually been hit that heavily by previous bombing attacks. I'm afraid there was obviously an element of also seeing what this new weapon would achieve. And that was one way of doing it, was to attack or target a city which had not been seriously destroyed by conventional bombing. Nagasaki was only sort of added to the list, I think, really at a later stage. Slightly like some of the debates which took place over the bombing of Dresden after the Red Army at the Yalta Conference had demanded that more railway junctions and marshalling yards should be hit so that after the Ardennes offensive, German troops from the Western Front should not be allowed to come and reinforce the Eastern Front.
Some historians have argued that the bombings were not only of military necessity, but also moral retribution for what Japan had done. Was a perfectly good reason to bomb Hiroshima and Nagasaki. To what extent did Truman and American military leaders grapple with those moral questions? Because, yes, we've discussed the fire bombings, but atomic weaponry is in a whole nother category.
Yes, they certainly are. I'm sure that there were certain individuals who were so embittered about the way that the Japanese had treated prisoners. One has to remember, after their capture of the Philippines and the Bataan Death March and things like that, there were many who believed in moral retribution. I think moral retribution is a terrible term. I think it's appalling, both philosophically, religiously, or anything like that. But there were a number who did feel very strongly that way, and the way that they had treated prisoners of war, starvation, labor, humiliation, and sort of torture and execution, to say nothing of the way that they had treated indigenous populations in the Far East. And so that had created a tremendous anger and bitterness. And I'm sure that that did play a part in the, if you like, the background, the emotion, the feelings. But I don't think there was a sort of a decision on the grounds of moral retribution by leading members of the administration at that particular time. I don't know, somebody may prove me wrong with some document or whatever, but I think that it was a background emotion rather than a general reason for actually using atomic weapons.
I'm trying to avoid asking too many counter-historical questions here because they're difficult, if not impossible, to truly answer. But here's another one. If the U.S. had developed the atomic bomb while the war in Europe was going on, do you think the U.S. might have used the bomb in Europe?
Counterfactuals are important questions to pose. Answering them is a very different matter.
And I get to ask them and you have to answer them.
I know. That's what's so unfair. But I don't know. I think that certainly if Hitler had carried out the massacre of prisoners that he wanted to do, for example, after the Dresden bombing, then there might well have been a temptation to drop a nuclear weapon at that particular stage. But on the other hand, I think it's most unlikely because we know that the prevailing winds in Western Europe are westerlies, and basically the radioactive fallout would have drifted eastwards over the Red Army. And the one thing that Eisenhower, above all, was determined not to do was to have any blue-on-blue incidents with the Red Army. And in fact, in some cases, he leaned far too far over backwards to avoid this. One of the reasons why he wouldn't go on to Berlin in 1945. So I think actually on balance, in fact, I'm pretty sure on balance that actually they would not have done it. It would have been too dangerous and too unpredictable.
It's a difficult question to answer. There's a racial element too, at least for those who pose this question, saying that there were fewer reservations about dropping these bombs on Japanese people.
Yes, as I was saying earlier, there was a very strong racist element of dehumanization on both sides in the Pacific War. I think there's no doubt about that.
Was the atomic bombing an atrocity? Is that even the right question to ask when we consider all of World War II was one large atrocity?
Yes, war is an atrocity, but I think that the definition of war crimes, at any rate, is one of the killing of civilians deliberately rather than accidentally. Now, the Americans could have justified it on the grounds that with the call-up of civilians into the militia and with the garrison in Hiroshima itself, it was a military target. But I think that would have been probably a bit disingenuous anyway. The fact was, as we've, I think, said and covered already, that, I mean, from an earlier stage in the war, whether it was the bombing of Poland in 1939, the bombing of Warsaw, which the Germans started, every form of area bombing and city bombing was already an atrocity. I mean, it started in the Spanish Civil War with not just the bombing of Madrid, but Guernica, the invention of napalm and carpet bombing and so forth. This was already the method of warfare of totalitarian states. Now, in Britain, there was at the beginning a tremendous reluctance to bomb cities. In fact, there was even a document from the RAF, which was actually attacked by the Army and the Navy, saying this is a doctrine of baby killing, when they said that we're going to have to go on to do aerial bombing of cities because we simply can't get the accuracy. So I think from that point of view, when the Germans started to bomb London, that is when the RAF and the British decided that aerial bombing of cities was the only way of retaliating, the only effective way of retaliating. So from that point on, to talk about an atrocity, whether by conventional weapons or by atomic weapons, I think one's probably going to go around in circles on definitions.
And at the time, international law didn't recognize atomic bombs. I don't know if that matters at all in this discussion. I mean, there were no atomic weapons up until that point.
No, I mean, they were secret, obviously, until the moment they were bombed. Stalin knew about it in advance, of course, through his spies in the Manhattan Project, but also because of that moment at the Potsdam Conference when Truman told him about the bomb. And, of course, Stalin kept a very, shall we say, careful smile on his face as he nodded as if he'd learnt it for the first time. But, of course, he knew all about it already through his own spies organized by Beria.
One of the great pieces of trivia about this period we're discussing is that Harry Truman, as vice president, did not know about the existence of the bomb. He only learned about it upon Roosevelt's death when he became the president of the United States. Was there any debate within the Truman administration about letting the Japanese know they had the atomic bombs in order to compel them to surrender? Because Japan was defeated. Everyone could see that Japan was defeated. They simply hadn't surrendered yet.
Well, that's true. But again, it was the army refused to be defeated, or refused to even consider the idea of defeat or surrender. But no, I do not know whether there was an actual plan to inform the Japanese. I think it's most unlikely, the very notion of giving away a secret in advance, because actually the Japanese would not have believed it. They would have rejected it as a bluff or whatever it may be. So I think it's most unlikely. I may be proved wrong, but I think it's most unlikely.
I think you are right about that. After the first bomb was dropped, Japanese leaders refused to believe that such a thing was possible. So August 6th and August 9th, 1945, 2 atomic weapons are dropped in the course of 3 or 4 days. And it ushers in a new age. But since then, no atomic or nuclear weapons have ever been used again on people. So it might be easy to say, well, of course no one would be so foolish to ever launch a nuclear missile, because it would bring about the end of the world as we know it. Yet for decades after the Civil War, anti-nuclear activists warned such an event was distinctly possible. Do you believe that fear has subsided here in the 21st century? And there are still tens of thousands of warheads in existence, but it seems that fear has subsided some.
Well, actually, I think that the danger is probably much greater now than it was during the Cold War. At least during the Cold War, it would have been purely an accidental triggering or whatever. Now there is the chance of a dictator who would use, if you like, what I think is described as the Erostratus complex, the idea that if he's going to go down, he's going to pull the world down with him so that he will always be remembered in that particular way. And I think there is always that danger. And I think, funny enough, that danger is greater now than it was during the Cold War. But as we know, there were a couple of genuine mistakes during the Cold War which could have led to nuclear Armageddon. And so, yes, we're extremely fortunate that that never actually took place.
The Cuban Missile Crisis is said to be the closest to seeing a nuclear war.
Well, no, actually, there was another one later on, which was actually saved by a Soviet colonel who realized suddenly that this panic, which was starting in Moscow because of various signals which had been picked up, I think it was under Andropov or whatever, they suddenly had convinced themselves through their own mindset that the Americans really were going to try and suddenly steal a march on them by launching a first strike. There were mistakes and mistaken analysis of what was happening. And he was the one who actually finally got the message through to the bosses that, no, we shouldn't be at what they would have called DEFCON 1 or whatever, the Soviet equivalent. It's an ordinary exercise. The Americans are actually not trying to attack us. And that was the closest of all, I think.
I'm actually not familiar with that episode. So my final question to you, Sir Antony, and the answer may seem obvious, but why does this question still demand our attention today? Why must we still grapple with the decision to drop atomic bombs on 2 Japanese cities?
It, I think, quite rightly demands our attention today because of the massive slaughter, the dehumanization of all of those thousands, hundreds of thousands of individuals who might be in that city down below. And I think a fear of the power that we can now achieve through technology, through science, of destruction. It was never imaginable before. But then you've only got to see the development of warfare coming up from the American Civil War through the War of 1870 and then the First World War, the increasing mechanization of warfare, the industrialization of warfare, and therefore its killing potential. Now, the next stage, and I think the thing that we should be frightened of in the future, is the killer machines, the killer robots, not just the drones, but every other form of unmanned vehicle, tank, aircraft, whatever it might be, where we may no longer have full control over the decision of life and death. And I think that this is something which is probably far more frightening than, say, the decision-making over the atomic bombs, because any country now which basically relies on old-fashioned human decision-making is actually going to be at a disadvantage against taking on, say, the Russian or the Chinese developments in unmanned killing technology. And I think that we will see some really very, very scary developments. We've seen this to a certain degree in Nagorno-Karabakh with the drones, with those Turkish drones which were used there. And certainly sort of, the next stage onwards is not very far away.
Sir Antony Beevor, author of The Second World War, among many superb books about the terrible wars of the past century, we thank you for giving us a lot to think about today. And if you didn't catch our conversation in June, go to historyasithappens.com. Antony and I discussed the 80th anniversary of Operation Barbarossa, and you can get caught up on all the recent episodes while you're at it. historyasithappens.com. On the next episode of History as It Happens, why the sudden fascination with Hungary?
But you can't say simply that, okay, it's a nice country. I would like to come here and to live here because it's a nicer life. This is not a human right to come here. No way, because it's our land.
To some on the American right, Viktor Orban's Hungary is a model for a Christian, conservative, authoritarian government. But in Europe, people with living memories of the fascist past worry what's happening in Hungary and elsewhere do not bode well for democracy. That's next, as we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times.